各位女士、各位先生，非常欢迎大家参加罗家伦国际汉学讲座的系列演讲。那这一个系列演讲是我们这个年度的第2场的系列演讲。那我们昨天已经举办了1场，然后我们接下来星期4跟星期5都还有各1场演讲跟1场工作坊。如果大家有兴趣的话，欢迎大家参加。那我们今天非常荣幸请到哲学系系主任王华老师来这边当这一次这个主持人，然后底下就把时间交给王老师。
OK， 我站在这边可以。好。So, good afternoon, everybody. It's really my pleasure to be here to chair this session. I'm Ellie Wang from the philosophy department. So, yesterday, Professor Paramore introduced the global historical method to us, and which is inspired by the approach of the Cambridge New History of Japan. And he offered very important critiques of national history and cultural essentialism and centrism and Eurocentrism and elite history, right? So, and we also heard some of the ideas about the alternatives to these approaches and methodologies to the study of history. Now, today, he promised to demonstrate to us how these alternative historical methodologies may be realized in the study of a history of Confucianism by analyzing the chapters in the Cambridge History of Confucianism. So, one of the things he said yesterday, which I deeply agree with, is that Confucianism is a living tradition. Now, this is a very important point for many of us living in Taiwan, and I believe for many others living in other traditions, these traditions don't seem relevant anymore. They kind of seem dead, something that should be left in the ancient past. Now, yesterday, Professor Paramore opened our eyes to new methodologies. I'm pretty sure today he will open our eyes to the liveliness of Confucianism. Thank you.
Turn it on. On. Yes, it's working. Okay, fantastic. Thanks very much. I'll just get the PowerPoint to the correct bit, which I think is there. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Your introduction was particularly wonderful because it saved me time to recap what happened yesterday. So I actually had a short little section where I was going to talk about what I talked about yesterday, but thankfully you already talked about it. And this slide sort of shows the critiques, but also the alternatives we presented from global history of ways of doing a history of Confucianism. And indeed, I promised that I would show how we do that today. So that is the next part of this talk. So I think I showed this yesterday. This is the sort of basic contents of the Cambridge History of Confucianism. So what I'm going to do today is just take you through the Cambridge History of Confucianism, and we'll see how far we get. There are 30-something chapters, so we might not actually get through all of it, but we'll have a look at some hopefully interesting parts of it. So I think as we showed yesterday, this is the table, this is the first part of the table of contents that shows the different parts. The parts are organised chronologically, and then within each of these parts we have several chapters. So that's part 1, for instance. That's part 2. That's part 3. Part 4, the early modern period. Part 5, the modern period. And we have a sort of section at the end with a couple of thematic essays. One by Watanabe Hiroshi, who of course began this series of lectures about this time last year, and another one from Ge Jiaguang. So, what I'd like to do today then is just firstly introduce, make a few very brief opening comments, which will probably appear in the introduction of the Cambridge History of Confucianism that I'm writing at the moment. And then I'm going to take you through some of the chapters from the beginning, moving chronologically through. So as I do that, for the purposes of this talk, I'll try and connect with some of the issues we brought up yesterday. So, Confucianism has been a major force in the cultural history of what are now China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam for thousands of years, affecting art, literature, science, politics. Confucianism was not only a major ideological and cultural determiner in East Asian pre-modernity, but also played a critical role in East Asia's transition to modernity, mediating the cultural recreation of scientific and medical thought, the recreation of major political ideologies of modernity, notably liberalism, where Confucianism played a very big role in East Asian recreations of liberalism in particular. Beyond Asia, Confucianism was also a major topic of intellectual discussion in early modern Europe. From the political theories of the likes of Voltaire, Leibniz, Montesquieu, and then it transitioned, or the use of Confucianism in Europe transitioned in the 19th century, where Confucianism was used and abused through the ideologies of Western imperialism to sort of create this idea of timeless Asian despotism. And Confucianism was used and abused in that process also. Confucianism continued to play a key role in the 20th century, of course, for Chinese modernizers, be they the likes of Sun Yat-sen, but also, of course, Mao Zedong, who formulated their different but both revolutionary ideologies in relation or sort of against an imagination of Confucianism. And then those Asian leaders in the mid-20th century who opposed the two revolutionary Chinese states, the Japanese Empire, of course, that opposed both the Chinese states and the satellite states of the Japanese Empire, Manchukuo in occupied China, used Confucianism, had a pro-Confucian approach as part of their war against the Chinese nationalists and communists. And as Prasenjit Duara, who was mentioned yesterday, as Prasenjit Duara has pointed out, in the transition, in a sense, World War II never ended in East Asia, it just transitioned into the Cold War. And as Prasenjit Duara has pointed out, Japanese imperial ideology and imperialism just transitioned to become the American neo-imperialism. And states like Cold War South Korea, South Vietnam, Taiwan, and Singapore then used Confucianism in a similar way to how the Japanese Empire had used it against the communists. Confucianism thus continued to play a considerable role in the political ideologies of World War II and the Cold War, mainly in the Asia-Pacific, but by extension, thereby also in the United States and beyond. Today, people talk about Confucian revivals in different parts of East Asia, and some people even talk about Confucianism as the blueprint for some kind of new international relations systems or domestic governance. So this Cambridge history basically just tries to introduce Confucianism through the longue durée history of the tradition, beginning with its prehistoric Chinese roots, as we see on the slide, and extending through the entire history of Confucianism in all these different places. Confucianism is increasingly referenced in contemporary writing on international relations and politics, as we discussed yesterday, global history and comparative philosophy. Yet in precisely these academic fields, knowledge of the longue durée, transnational history of Confucianism can sometimes be very limited. And this is despite the fact that, there is a lot of knowledge in the academy about the history of Confucianism in fields like sinology and East Asian history. So the volume tries to make that large body of specialist historical knowledge available. It therefore presents Confucianism in this process of historic change, revealing pluralism, showing how Confucianism both is affected by and affects the historical periods and societies it exists within. And the chronological outline of the book, which we see here, deliberately gives equal weight to early medieval, high medieval, early modern, and modern periods, as well as the ancient period that we'll begin our conversation about today. So this means that the book, despite being about a predominantly pre-modern Asian tradition, interacts with various interests in the global history field. And this transnational nature of the approach is, I guess, one particular feature of this volume. As we touched upon yesterday, and we'll see in a moment, each of these chronological parts have certain chapters which repeat through them. So every chronological part has chapters specifically about interstate or intercultural or transnational relationships. Every part has a chapter specifically about gender, family relations, things like this. So there's a certain pattern to it. So I think you can see from this short background the attempt to break down national history, this idea of projecting modern national history back into the past. We try to break that down by using thematic rather than national categories, as we'll see in the chapters and as discussed yesterday. By not treating China or Chinese empires any differently to any other states, we also resist the centrism discussed yesterday. The fact that one or two chapters for each historical period focus on interstate relations also complicates traditional notions of sinocentrism, because as you will see when we talk about the chapters, in most periods the real history of interstate relations in the Sinosphere does use Confucian forms, but it doesn't work from the centre out. There is no discernible centre in most forms of real international relations that we historically study. So hierarchy is part of the system, but hierarchy is reversible, interchangeable, pluralistic. Lastly, the thematic approach, for instance, by having gender as one theme in each historical period, enforces us to look across society, which may hopefully militate against this elite history approach that we critiqued and offered alternatives to yesterday. Right, so they're the introductory comments. Let's jump into the chapters. Now, before I jump into the chapters, I'm about to talk about other people's work. Everything I say is my understanding of their work. It's important to say that because we have not yet submitted this manuscript to the publisher. So the point that we were at in this is I have basically all the chapters, nearly all the chapters. I have them and I'm editing them, but I haven't returned them all to the authors. So I've returned some of them to the authors. Some of them I have the final, absolute final version of the chapters in this computer, actually. But some of them I'll still interact with the author. So things that I say today may potentially be my misunderstandings. It's possible, yeah? Once we get to publication, I should have had a process with the authors where there are no misunderstandings, or there would be very few misunderstandings. However, we're still in the middle of that process. So this is a caveat that everything I'm about to say, I'm about to talk about Mick Hunter's chapter. I'm going to tell you what I think Mick Hunter is saying. Well, actually, Mick Hunter's chapter is pretty much finished, so that's okay. But some of the later chapters, it's my view of what they're saying, okay? And particularly relating it back to my comments yesterday, well, that's obviously me making that relationship, not them, right? So, yeah, this is me talking about other people's work, okay? It's a secondary source, not a primary. So let's have a look at, firstly, chapter 1 that we see here by Mick Hunter, defining Confucianism in the early content. And all chapters in this part 1 are limited to that time period. They're all about that time period. So chapter 1 by Mick Hunter of Yale University is a chapter about the definition of Confucianism, but centred on the beginnings, on the early period of Confucianism. He begins by doing something typically problematic in Western scholarship, which is focusing on Confucius, you know, as a person, sort of reifying this person of Confucius. And he uses this in a quite interesting way. Although he makes clear that, of course, in the tradition, in Confucianism, and indeed in the approach of Confucius himself, it is the ancient sage kings, of course, that are most deserving of reverence and emulation. But still, Mick Hunter goes into the question of Confucius, the person, to begin with, to open out the conversation. And for a publication in English, in the English language, part of the major readership of which will be non-specialists, this is an understandable and perhaps necessary approach. But Hunter looks at the concept of Confucius critically. Hunter zooms directly in to begin with on what he calls the Kongzi problem, on the model of the Socratic problem. And I know there's a lot of philosophers here, right? So you know what the Socratic problem is, right? The idea that the person doesn't write themselves, somebody after them writes about it. So he cheekily, Mick Hunter's cheeky, because he uses a quote from Han Feize, actually, to point to the inherent multiplicity of meanings and approaches attributed to Confucius even in the time of Han Feize. So he begins by showing us, even in Han Feize's time, Confucius is multiple, right? Nobody can agree who this person is or what the definition of the person is. So that's an excellent opening problem for our volume, because it demonstrates that a core issue of the volume and of any studies of Confucianism, or any studies of any great tradition, right, of any great tradition, it's multiplicity. And that this has been an issue, this is not some postmodern issue. Derrida did not invent this issue. This issue was already a problem for someone like Han Feize. Hunter then swiftly moves on to emphasise even further this aspect of multiplicity by introducing commentary, this central part of the Confucian tradition, commentary. The fact that the most significant alleged work of Confucius, the Spring and Autumn Annals, was presented in multiple competing commentarial forms already from the very beginning, again, that we find this text, is another emphasis on the multiplicity and meaning, multiplicity of meaning and character at even the earliest turn in the tradition. And Hunter then moves to character, actual character itself, the character of Confucius, comparing utterances from Confucius to comparable figures from other traditions. For instance, Jesus. To emphasize Confucius, the person Confucius, or the constructed person Confucius, Confucius's own reluctance to act in a way that made it easy for followers to emulate him or to create a coherent transmission tradition. So he's saying from the beginning there's always multiple voices through multiple commentaries, but he's also suggesting that Confucius himself deliberately says things, acts in a way to make the transmission problematic, to make the transition, the transmission difficult. And there's an implication here, I see an implication, again this is my interpretation, that a messy or pluralist transmission tradition is perhaps even deliberate, that this is a deliberate act. And I think certainly Mick Hunter is saying that this is a notable feature of the tradition. So talking about things that run through the tradition all through time, I think he's suggesting this almost deliberate, this creation of a situation where you must have a multiplicity in the way you analyse things. This is perhaps a sort of plus point of the tradition. This is a strength, if you, he doesn't use the word strength, but possibly a strength of the tradition, and certainly a notable feature of it. Hunter then turns to canon again, reiterating that a canonical position of Confucius Analects did not appear until well into the Han Dynasty at the earliest. In a later chapter, the next chapter actually, by Michael Nyland will reinforce her own argument that canon was actually not formed until after the Han Dynasty. For Hunter, quote, the problem with seeing Confucianism as a reasonable idea of using, quote, the classics as a blueprint for governance, or, and he makes up this word, Confucius canonism, the problem that Hunter sees in making the classics a blueprint for government or for creating this idea of a Confucian canon are, one, that it's very difficult to describe what that blueprint is with any degree of specificity. Secondly, that any idea, even if you are able to grasp that, any idea of the canon is clearly an imperial innovation, as he puts it. It clearly begins from a time which is much later. Now, this is his view, and it's a little bit different to the view of Michael Nyland, which will follow in a later chapter. And we'll come back to that in a second. So Hunter, following Zafari, also, he then moves on to this idea of this word that you see in English, ruism, right? The idea that the ru, you know, this idea that we might not be able to talk about Confucius and Confucianism, but we can talk about the ru. Now, following a scholar called Zafari, a Swiss scholar called Zafari, Hunter also rejects the idea of ruism or the idea that such a group existed as a coherent or meaningful institution. Again, for a range of reasons that have been outlined in Zafari's work. The imperial roots of the term, the breadth of meaning, and the lack of coherence, even from the Han Dynasty onwards, makes this idea of the ru also not a particularly useful one for defining the tradition. Now, this is a very important point to be made early on in a book like this, because many scholars in the West, particularly those, you know, in philosophy-related areas, often try to resolve or avoid the issue of Confucianism's definition by calling it, and they invent this word, ruism, and holding that it is the teaching of a discrete group of people, a kind of religious or religious specialists called the ru. Right? They thereby try to avoid historical change, or at least stabilise it. But by arguing that at least you have a continuity of personnel through this book, through this group of people called the ru, Hunter just demolishes this idea. Right? Again, using other scholarship from Zafari, but also through his own analysis. Hunter also points out that while others identified Confucius as ru, His position on the term, Confucius's position on the term, was more complex. He quotes from Confucius. This is Hunter quoting Confucius in English. Most people nowadays use ru indiscriminately, often hurling it at each other as a pejorative. So this is from one of the commentaries of the Li Ji attributed to Confucius. So Hunter seems to suggest that Confucius himself, in the tradition, shares many of these doubts. This resonates with Hunter's earlier implication that the tradition, through the way it transmits, is deliberately vague. Doubt is therefore, for Hunter, seemingly a part of the definition or the nature of the tradition. Hunter contextualizes the idea of Confucius from a different vantage point than other famous ones in English, like Lionel Jensen's, from a vantage point rooted very much in what we call the history of early China. You know, that's all the sources, all the arguments he's using come from the history of so-called early China. And from that position, he deals with the idea of the classics and canon, and then he demolishes this idea of ru. Right? So I would say with this chapter, the book is off to a flying start. Right? This is the beginning. Then we move on to 2 chapters by Michael Nyland of the University of California, Berkeley. Michael Nyland, while reinforcing the state of the field articulated by Hunter, where ru, Confucius, and Confucianism as categories have been pulled apart, and the pluralist nature of the textual tradition is established, while she agrees with that, her focus, which is on the Han Dynasty, through that focus, Nyland then directly engages how political authority and classical learning interact during the Han Dynasty, during both the Han Dynasties. Her first chapter focuses on debunking previous scholarship's contention that the Han Dynasty was in any way ruled primarily through Confucianism, or even through classical learning. And this is, for those of you, some of you might be aware of Michael Nyland's work, this is an argument she is famous for. So she argues in this chapter in quick succession, 1, against the primacy of Confucian teaching in classical texts. So the first point is, within the classical tradition at this time, in the Han Dynasty, Confucian texts were not dominant. 2, she relativizes the power of classical learning. Classical learning itself was only one form of authority and power in comparison to other forms of authority and power. And also she points out that 3, even when classical learning is clearly used to decide issues, for instance, in imperial conferences, it is the plurality of opinion, including challenges to Confucius interpretations, including bringing in non-Confucian arguments, through which classical learning is empowered. So Confucianism is not the main thing in classical learning. Classical learning is only one of many things in decision-making. When classical learning is used in decision-making, there's always plurality is the basis of that process. The idea of a Confucian orthodoxy in the Han is therefore challenged. In Nyland's view, she says this, it's a post-ipso facto construction of Sung learning. This is just a Sung projection. Confucianism did not constitute political orthodoxy of the Han Dynasty. Now, to me, this is an important and very early relativization of the linkage between Confucianism and elite political culture, which is so often made. Many people would simply say that Confucianism is elite political culture. This makes that difficult. By showing that classical learning wasn't Confucian, certainly wasn't only Confucian, that classical learning was only one source of authority and power among many, and that even when it was used, plurality was key. This challenges visions of Confucianism as a unified ideology of rule. So that's the 2 chapters by Michael Nyland. Then move on to the next chapter by Anne Kinney of the University of Virginia, which is focused on gender in the same period of the Han Dynasty. Focusing on Liu Shang's Lianu Juan and later iterations of it, Kinney, while acknowledging the hierarchical positioning of noble women beneath men in some parts of the text, analyses it mainly through the concept of dynastics. Contrasting dynastics to patriarchy, she points out that in this and later Han text focusing on the role of noble women, and often aimed at them as readers, the role of women within dynastic succession or schism was highlighted. So for her, these are dynasties, yeah, obviously. So succession, hereditary succession through the line is key. And women's role in that is very important when there are issues in succession, and succession is the main way that power is transferred. Therefore, this is different to patriarchy, right? Because women have a role in certain situations. This leads Kinney to set up a range of polarities, or to analyse a range of polarities identified from the text, inner versus outer, female versus male, provisional versus institutional, adoptive versus natural. These are all dichotomies we are aware of relating to gender in Confucian texts. But she suggests that in dynastic systems, women are seen rightfully to wield power in the former situational categories. So in inner and outer, the men are on the outer, but on the inner, that's the woman's world. And sometimes the inner is key. For instance, dynastic succession. So she suggests that dynastic women are seen to rightfully wield power in these situations, and these situations arise regularly in the life of the dynasty and state. Situations where, quote, it is appropriate for women to step in. Here we see in practice one of the methodologies we spoke of yesterday, the replacement of categories of civilization and empire with more open and anthropologically useful categories. Here, the category of dynasty. Remember, we actually talked about big history written using this category yesterday. Here we see, by realising dynasty in American English, dynasty, rather than simple textual ideology as a basis of power, roles of noble women begin to make more sense. The same categories which limit, for instance, inner, also give superior power under the right circumstances. This chapter sets the stage for chapters in later chronological parts of the volume, where usually, similarly, women are not seen as excluded from power as in classical patriarchy, but rather through their familial dynastic roles are attributed particular areas of political power, often provisional, but nonetheless regular in the exercise of power. Of course, this is an overall political thought framework, of course, in these societies where everybody's political position is role determined, emperor or vassal, gentry or peasant. So, of course, gender is not the only area where roles are central. We then move on to the 5th chapter here, and this is one of 2 chapters by Erica Brindley of Pennsylvania State University. Erica Brindley's, the first of her 2 chapters, Confucianism, Civilization and Huasha Ethnicity, links the value of civilization, culture, Wen, in the Confucianism of early China to what she sees as the construction of a Huasha ethnicity. And she uses this word ethnicity, differentiating it from simple lineage or cultural identity. Brindley uses Confucius Analects, the Zuozhuan, and Mencius to argue that ideas of continuing the Zhou, Wuzhongzhou, this idea of Confucians and Confucius as continuing the Zhou, is not a concept of continuing the actual lineage of the Zhou, and not even just of a culture, but of a whole package of attributes which she describes using the word ethnicity. She quotes another scholar, Ulf Bergerton, quote, "Lineage here is clearly not a bloodline or even an ancestral lineage, but one of culture, Wen, and its civilized qualities." And then she says, I quote from Erica, "It certainly doesn't seem that Confucius thinks of Zhou in terms of its political... it certainly does seem that Confucius thinks of Zhou in terms of its political, cultural, and ethnic aspects all at once, without separating them from each other." So this idea of culture, of course, is then contrasted with those who are not cultured. The civilization is contrasted with the barbarian. And this then leads for a fascinating analysis where Brindley employs sections from the Mencius, actually, sections about taxation to argue that the ethnic conception and identity of Huasha culture required commitment to socio-political norms, not only ethics. This was then famously contrasted geographically with the peripheries associated with various kinds of barbarians. Brindley provides plenty of examples of often derogatory passages about the bestial nature of these people's languages, customs, and familial, social, and political relations. But she also points out that whereas in the Analects, Mencius, and Zuozhuan, such derogatory passages are common, parts of the Li Ji, by contrast, although mapping the barbarians onto the periphery, make no moral judgments about them as such. So she does acknowledge diversity within the textual tradition on how this other is to be conceived. Brindley's main point in the chapter, however, is to establish the nature of this identity. What other scholars have referred to similarly by using the term ritual culture, she instead sees as a form of ethnicity due to its shared heritage, transmission, and emotional connection to place. And I guess another simple reason why she doesn't just see it as ritual culture is she's looking from outside. If you look from inside, looking from within the Huasha culture, you could see it as ritual culture. But if you're looking from the other direction, in, then it's obviously something more than that. The chapter thereby challenges directly national and, of course, imperial approaches to the history of Confucianism by looking at the texts from the perspective of outsiders, from looking from a different perspective at these texts. And this, I would say, is a kind of history from below, to touch on one of our methodologies from yesterday. Now, this approach is even more articulated in Erica Brindley's next chapter that you see here. Yeah, Confucianism and the Han Imperial Presence on the Viet Borderlands. So I'd like to talk about that chapter briefly. That chapter develops rather a focus on what the implications are for the other, for the non-Huasha, when exposed to this cultural ethnic paradigm associated with Confucianism. So here she uses cases from the Han, Nan-Viet border regions, which modern-day Guangdong, Guangxi, sometimes parts of northern Vietnam, between 200 BC and 50 CE. And she begins with Zhao Tuo, a former Qin general who set himself up as the king of Nan-Viet upon the collapse of the Qin Empire and ruled until 137 BC. Through sources narrating the interactions between him and the court and officials of the new Han Empire, Brindley demonstrates how the kind of civilizational and ethnic constructs outlined in her previous chapter were deployed and imagined in the reality of peripheral early imperial society. Zhao Tuo, and I'll quote, Zhao Tuo, despite ruling over a non-Huaxia population, utilized Chinese imperial statecraft culture, made up of aspects now generally identified as Confucian, to build a strong state to the south of the growing Han dynasty, giving that state the trappings of Zhou imperial culture. At times, conforming to Han demands to recognize Han overlordship as a kingdom under the empire, and at times not. Regardless, even when paying tribute to the Han and accepting office as a minister of the Han Empire externally, within Nam-Viet and in relation to other peoples bordering it to the south, Zhao and his descendants continued to identify themselves as the emperors, continued to identify themselves with imperial titles. And actually, so end quote, end quote. And this is actually really interesting. This was amazing to me to read this, because this is actually the first of many precedents of such behaviour, which by the early modern period was occurring all around East and Southeast Asia. You know, this thing of people using Confucian paradigms to rule a clearly non-Chinese state and applying that to other states was very common by the early modern period, as we'll see. So when international relations theorists now call what they now call the Tiansha system with subordinate kingdoms, actually operates in this example more often than not through overlapping systems which exist at the same time. In the historical reality of these Tiansha systems, the same ruler would be called an emperor one day in one context and a king or a minister the next day in another context. People would swap these roles around, and depending on which state, which of the multiple, which different group they're speaking to. So Brindley's article goes on to use the same area. The same article then goes on to use the same area to demonstrate a very different kind of Confucian role in imperial statecraft dating from the later Han dynasty, when the dynasty decided to take direct control of the surrounding kingdoms and administer what had been Nan-Viet through commanderies. Brindley, using sources from the Book of the Latter Han, shows how military governors like Ma Yuan then employed Confucianism in a totally different way, actually seeking to transform the general population through Jiaohua. This involved pressuring populations to adopt Han dress and ritual practices, for instance in marriage, according to Brindley. Backing up the argument from her previous chapter on the importance of what she calls ethnicity, Brindley also highlights a number of quotes from the Book of the Latter Han, where the presence of Han prisoners, so hardly exemplars of Confucian morality, were used by imperial authorities in Nam-Viet to so-called improve the customs of the people. So this again does seem to indicate something more significant happening than issues of ritual culture or practice, although it also opens up the question whether this particular practice could be considered part of Confucianism. So this chapter opens up a range of questions, but certainly changes our gaze, the direction of our gaze, to look from the outside in. The next chapter, and I think it's the last chapter of this part, Civilizing Activities in the Red River Plain by Catherine Churchman, also focusing on the same area, deepens the discussion of the effect of these cultural or ethnic conceptions on other populations. Churchman approaches some of the same issues highlighted by Brindley, but from a different field of scholarship, from within the field of Vietnamese historiography. So rather than, Brindley's would be identified primarily as an early China scholar, Churchman would be identified, is identified sometimes as a Vietnam scholar, for instance, right? So coming from a different scholarly background. And this gives us a complex lens through which to see from the outside in, and through a long tradition of complex historiographical development, a range of different ways Confucian's cultures can impact on another society and the way that impact can be understood. For instance, right from the beginning of the chapter, Churchman points out, quote, Confucian ideas were not the only intellectual tradition current in the south of China among the people of Gao Chao. When he talks about Gao Chao, he's talking also about this same area, right, of Guangdong, Guangxi and northern Vietnam, amongst the people of Gao Chao during this time period. Viewed from the perspective of Han writers, this area was a distant, peripheral region and cultural backwater into which the superior Chinese civilization flowed. But we know from archaeological evidence and other clues gleaned from Chinese texts that the Red River Plain in particular, the area around Hanoi, right, was actually a cosmopolitan centre well connected by maritime trade routes to the Buddhist and Hindu kingdoms of Southeast Asia, and was also the home to migrants from the Indian subcontinent and Central Asia, whose religions and ideas had also begun to thrive there alongside those ideas from the north. End quote. The reality that Confucianism is almost always just one of many cultural traditions present in any given location is particularly pertinent in the Red River Delta and across what is now Vietnam, most of which, for most of history, has been more influenced by Brahmic, Hindu, Theravada Buddhist and local mountain cultures than Confucianism. And this, of course, holds for many other parts of Asia and, of course, for many parts of what is now China. Right? Writing from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and having long studied in Australia and Taiwan, Churchman is also very aware of the histories of cultural interaction where only one side's written records are preserved, where there's a cultural interaction but only one side has writing. Quote, we are totally reliant on the Chinese texts for knowledge of indigenous peoples, their culture and customs, but that these texts are mostly written from a viewpoint of unquestioned cultural superiority. End quote. What Churchman then attempts is a history from below, drawing together not only some of the imperial sources also referenced by Brindley, but in addition, an assortment of more local sources gleaned from later encyclopedias, extant local sources, historical, linguistic, archaeological, and anthropological sources and analysis. This casts a different light on the process of cultural change in the area, showing alongside the coercion of the early Eastern Han dynasty, gradual change in custom and language that by the 3rd century CE makes it all but impossible to differentiate between settlers and locals in the Red River Delta. Churchman also presents a coda explaining how attitudes to Confucian identity and this earlier history changed in Vietnam through its own later history, where Confucian identity was synonymous with Vietnamese elite identity for most of the second millennium until the imperial engagements, French imperial engagements of the 20th century then turned this consensus on its head. These last two chapters of part one, one by Brindley and one by Churchman, thus not only challenge head-on the idea of sinocentrism, but use history from below, and in Churchman's case, use historical anthropology and archaeology and a geographical framing that we talked about yesterday, to open out new possibilities for early Confucian history. And I must say these last two chapters went much further than I imagined. My own field of historical inquiry is the early modern period. So this part of the book is where I am most ignorant, very ignorant, and I was surprised how much these writers could say about places like this part of northern Southeast Asia at that time. So that's the end of part one, and then we move into part two, which covers the period 300 AD to 900 AD. Part two takes us into a world where other polities and ethnicities are taking up agency in the cultural recreation of Confucianism well beyond the areas associated with traditional China. Tineke de Hasselier's chapter, Confucian Statecraft across Multipolar Northeast Asia, like the previous three chapters, focuses on Confucianism's role beyond the so-called Huasha area. It is very different from the previous three chapters, however, in that it looks at the employment of Confucian technologies by new, totally politically independent states to the east of the central Chinese area. Places we now identify as Manchuria, the Russian Far East, Korea, Japan, and which comprised between the 5th and 9th century states like Goguryeo, Silla, Pakche, Bohai or Pahe, depending on your political proclivity, and Japan. Looking thus at the political application of Confucian social technologies in non-Chinese states, de Hasselier herself emphasizes that her study is thus not focused on canonical text, but rather the application of political culture. It, quote, looks at how a state apparatus was given a veneer of humanitas even as it became increasingly technocratic. This makes it a kind of applied Confucianism that could function as an attractive model for others to emulate. End quote. De Hasselier couches this study of applied Confucianism, which I think is a wonderful phrase, by the way, applied Confucianism. She couches this in relation to Joshua Fogel's idea of the sinosphere, noting, however, that, quote, the term sinosphere does not imply a priori a superiority on behalf of the Huasha state model or political, social and cultural traditions, end quote. Like Churchman does for Southeast Asia, de Hasselier also begins by relativizing the position of Confucianism, pointing out that Buddhism also contributed much to state technologies. Quote, the model of the Confucian sage king was augmented with that of the Cakravatin, or wheel-turning universal king of Buddhism. Buddhism became, together with Confucianism, an intrinsic part of what bound the Northeast Asian states of the Sinosphere together. End quote. The interaction of traditions and position of Confucianism as one ingredient in a sociological mix, de Hasselier also sees as contributing an aspect of diversity to the nature of the Sinosphere in the diverse states of the period she interrogates. Quote, although our focus is on Confucianism, the people of the early Sinosphere did not draw sharp distinctions between different traditions. They moved more freely between intellectual categories, depending on the setting and the need as dictated by the situation. As a result of that lack of intellectual compartmentalization, none of these new states developed in the same mould. End quote. The scope of inquiry hinges on the major change de Hasselier sees happening in the second half of the first millennium. Quote, from the late 4th century, when the first Confucian Academy was established in Goguryeo, to the late 9th century, when a lively cultural exchange took diplomats between courts, monks to monasteries in many countries, and students to the Tang's civil service examinations, a vast transformation took place in Northeast Asia, and new modes of conflict resolution emerged as military conflicts made way for diplomacy and cultural competition. That shared culture, based on an understanding of a corpus of texts and cultural norms, only became possible after the elite of these states had first decided to adopt literary Sinitic for the utilitarian process of state building. End quote. State building, thus, was of course facilitated by writing, and although the personnel spreading that writing between these states were most often Buddhist monks, the language of power and the conceptual vocabulary of ritual and social organisation was Confucian. De Hasselier begins a roughly chronological narrative with the Han commanderies we are familiar with from Brindley and Churchman's chapters about the southeast. Northern parts of the Korean peninsula were also host to Han commanderies and limited urban colonisation. However, in a model very different to the Red River Delta, the Han commanderies in the north of Korea seem to have had negligible influence on the surrounding culture. Quote, in fact, it was not until 372 AD, some 60 years after the fall of the last Han commandery, that a ruler consciously sought out Confucian principles of government to train officials for his bureaucracy or to remodel his government, when in the second year of his reign, King Sosurim of Goguryeo founded the Tahak, the State Academy. The end of the 4th century, end quote. The end of the 4th century was thus a turning point where Goguryeo and then other states hosted and funded Buddhist monks, monasteries, who then assisted the states with the construction of Qin Han-style bureaucratic models. Quote, from this point on, the kings of Goguryeo, Pakche and Silla would one by one infuse their kingdom's organisation with a Confucian legalist bureaucratic blueprint. End quote. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, this system was based on the Han Empire's bureaucracy, centred around the emperor, and appealed to the basic Confucian tenets such as loyalty to the ruler and filial piety. End quote. Focusing on Silla, de Hasselier points out how Silla's observation of the conflict between the Sui Tang and Goguryeo led it initially to engage fully with the Tang imperial structures and use Tang as an ally against Goguryeo. Until then, after Goguryeu's defeat by the Tang, when Silla then began employing Confucian bureaucratic techniques, rather to defend itself against being similarly annexed by the Tang. So this familiar pattern, seen earlier in the Nam Viet, and as we'll see later, also arising in the Ming Dynasty, the conflict between the Ming Dynasty and Vietnam, for instance, and in early modern Japan, shows a pattern of non-Chinese states using Confucian statecraft to fight Chinese empires. Moving on to Japan, de Hassellier points out the similarities with Silla, both states using Confucianism with a good helping of Buddhism to progress centralization, adopting much Confucian ritual and organisation around the court and its officials, but not completing a bureaucratisation of governance. As for Silla, the same 7th century period saw Japan intensify the utilisation of Confucian statecraft and social technologies. For Japan, this included the Ritsuryo system of bureaucratic officers and laws, lifted from Sui examples and crafted in a clear Confucian format. De Hassellier also engages this state of Bohai, Pahai, Bohai. De Hassellier charts how Bohai followed a relatively independent course, establishing its own independent relations with other states like Japan, while engaging the Tang and Silla alternatively, depending on the ruler. Importantly, she sees Bohai as ultimately following Japan in a number of striking ways, emphasising independence through the use of sovereigns, through their own reign names and posthumous epitaphs. So the language usage always kept their sovereign, their ruler, as the emperor, right? As in Japan, usually anyway. And the attempt to construct a very large capital and to build a bureaucratic centre in the capital. The Pahe kings provide other indications that they saw themselves as the centre of the world, similar to the Tang emperors. As they expanded their territory north and eastward, they included areas from the Kanka Lake to the confluence of the Sungari and Amur rivers and the Pacific coast. By the 9th century, the existence of multiple, strong, enduring states in the areas now covered by central China, northeastern China, the two Koreas, Japan, and significant parts of the Russian Far East, affected a multipolar Confucian world, diplomatically and culturally connected, sharing literacy as well as administrative tools, and in regular high-level contact with each other. The point here is that much of the diplomacy and cultural connectedness now happening in this new sinosphere did not even involve a Chinese empire, but was rather being carried out between a range of non-Chinese Confucian actors. The Bohai-Japan relationship is a very good example of that. At this point in history, the Tang Empire was still central and of course was very big and powerful, and was often was involved in these interactions. But that changed later. Intriguingly, a whole bunch of states were now following a parallel set of paths of development, employing Confucian statecraft tools, including legal and bureaucratic systems. So that's the end of my comments on that opening chapter. The next chapter by Pablo Blitzstein is Confucianism, Aristocracy and Meritocracy in the 6th century. And this engages an issue well researched in medieval Chinese history, this idea of what is often considered a transition through adoption of certain Confucian processes, a transition from aristocratic to meritocratic rule. Pablo Blitzstein's The Rule of the Best, this second chapter in part 2, directly engages this issue of bureaucratization and what it means for noble power in these states and in the relationships between them. Beginning with an important reminder of the modern origins of aristocracy versus meritocracy as a paradigm, Blitzstein focuses on the 6th and 7th centuries that he sees as the birth of the bureaucratic system, inquiring into its relationship to noble and meritocratic power. The way Blitzstein sets up his chapter, however, opening with consideration of the influence of modern ideas of meritocracy in the late 20th century and their origins in Enlightenment ideas of nobility, notably Thomas Jefferson's idea of natural aristocracy, is a very good example in this volume of an overt, intellectual and historiographically informed approach to the underlying but still current issues in the topic he's dealing with. Blitzstein directly confronts the historiography contending that imperial China was meritocratic. And he sums up the historiographical approach claiming this meritocracy as follows, quote, According to them, the examinations broke with the aristocratic world of the Middle Ages and brought into East Asian history new patterns of social reproduction. Although aristocratic practices never disappeared completely, the civil service examinations created hierarchies on the basis of knowledge, talent, and the merits of the individual. These hierarchies did no longer result from birth privileges, as it had been the case in the aristocratic society that preceded them, but from the differences in education and access to symbolic resources. It was, in a way, a modern system because it shared many features with contemporary meritocracies. To put it in Alexander Woodside's terms, it was a, quote, lost modernity, end quote. So that's how people usually see it, including in very much in English language writing. Blitzstein then begins his corrective. Quote, this narrative is seductive, but it can also be misleading. Although it is undeniable that the civil service examinations were part of larger social changes in East Asia, the idea that the examination system was not in itself aristocratic owes a lot to the modern distinction between aristocracy and meritocracy. Setting up his historical inquiry in relation to the historiography and also current modern misunderstandings about the role of merit in political society, he then goes about his business of parsing the 6th and 7th centuries, primarily through a close reading of family instructions of the Yen clan, telling us, quote, I will analyse its criteria of social superiority and social differentiation. I will show that the transitional elite represented by this book embodies the compatibility, the old and new criteria of elite selection, and that so-called meritocratic moral and social standards should be seen as an aristocratic strategy of social legitimation. That is, as a new form of the rule of the best based on the standards of the medieval elites. Through focusing, end quote. Through focusing on a transitional moment then, he seeks to show not just transition, but also continuity, and also the way that intellectual and social systems are utilised and employed by the actual historical actors. He cites the transitional moment from the beginning of the Sui, where recommendations to office by impartials were abolished and use of the examination system increased. Before discussing this, however, Blitzstein is careful to critically analyse the concept of nobility in Chinese history. You know, for instance, pointing out that the European idea of nobility is based in land ownership, but that was not the case. That was not the idea of nobility that the Sui had, for instance. Based on this redefinition of the pre-Sui aristocracy, Blitzstein then moves on to engage Confucianism and its views on this issue. Blitzstein sees the shift away from the impartial system to examinations as primarily due to the Sui emperor being closer to northern Zhou elites than the southern elites. Following a prevailing following a prevailing view among the Northern Zhou elites, the emperor and his advisors thought that southern literati were just, to use a current expression of the time, insect carvers, who wasted their time in writing beautiful texts but had no idea of practical affairs. End quote. For Blitzstein, although the examination system may have had its roots in the Northern Way, the Sui transition was significant in extending the system to the whole country, continued on by the Tang, and this had clear impacts in terms of power centralisation. But returning to this issue of merit and aristocracy, Blitzstein asks, quote, "Was the abolition of the impartial the result of a fight between the new meritocracy of the Sui court and the old aristocracy of the previous centuries?" Some scholars have understood this process in this way, and from the institutional point of view, this historical break is indeed undeniable. However, if we focus on the assumptions behind the reform, there seems to be a clear continuity between critics and supporters of birth privilege. Both argue on the basis of the rule of the best. For some, the best were the illustrious families. For others, the best were talented and virtuous individuals. End quote. Therefore, the issue is, how were talent and virtue to be determined? By what processes, and also by what criteria? In this sense, for Blitzstein, Confucianism played a key role as the criteria norm of how talent and virtue were to be understood in the Sui. But he does not see that as a transition from aristocracy to meritocracy, rather as a new way of measuring aristocracy. Quote, "It is clear that there was no transition from birth to merit, and therefore from the medieval to the modern. In all cases, we find the same aristocratic ideal of recruiting the best ones, the meritorious ones, the aristoi. The question was, who should define the standards and where the best were to be found?" So that ends my comments on that chapter, and that chapter is then followed by another chapter, Confucian Identities in Medieval East Asia, by Anthony de Blassie of the State University of New York, I think at Albany. This really doubles down into the examination system. This is a chapter that really looks in detail at the examination system and exactly how it works, to make a whole range of arguments, and also to question this idea of whether there is a shift towards literary ability, which is again something in the historiography, whether there is this actual shift to literary ability, which is often talked about. I'm not going to talk any more about Anthony de Blassie's chapter, because I want to, if I look at the time, I see we're not going to have time to get through all of this. So I'm just going to move along to the next chapter after that, which is Jia Jinhua's family, gender and Confucianism in the 4th to 9th centuries. Here, Jia comprehensively explains the development of gender ideology during this period in relation to the changing social role and eventual decline of what she calls elite lineages, 世族, what Blitzstein in his article criticises much historiography for calling an aristocracy. Jia's analysis is thus based in the social construction, utility and roles of gender in elite society at that time. As with the social roles of the elite lineages, so too gender ideology changes through the period, and Jia charts those changes in gender ideology. Firstly, she maps out Confucian ethics in family and lineage in 3 spheres of familial ritual, ethical value, and cultural accomplishment. She then discusses the transmission and transition in the relationship between the Confucian gender ideology and changing gender patterns and women's roles. Most of the chapter is taken up with this second, deeply historically embedded story. In addition to pointing out various applications of the Confucian idea of gender separation, Jia provides copious, the whole yo li, the whole idea that men and women should be separate. She also provides copious examples of the importance of intimacy, respect and love between married partners. She contextualizes this in relation to the nature of elite marriage during the height of elite lineage social power in the period, and the social demands put upon elite families by the impartial recommendation system and other formal and informal systems of selection and power. The influence of Northwestern cultures, the Northern Way and so on, seen through several of the other chapters of this part, is also noted by Jia as significant in relation to the nature of gender roles. This, of course, included the fact that in the Northwestern states, it was comparatively common for women to play significant roles in governance. This, of course, also at a time in several dynasties, notably the Northern Way, where women were the rulers. Jia weaves together these various social factors, class, ethnic and ideological, to narrate a dynamic flow of changes to the application or manifestation of Confucian gender identities in the period. The inclusion of examples from 3 of the Korean kingdoms and Japan of this time reinforce the examples from the Northern Way of how actual practice of Confucian gender ideology manifested through an interaction with a range of different ethnic cultural factors, as well as non-Confucian ideologies and religions. Jia emphasizes at several points the role of xuanxue in particular. For instance, in relation to the significant attention she gives to the strong presence of intimacy in male-female elite relations during this period. So this emphasis on intimacy, by the way, and focusing on intimacy, I found very interesting because intimacy is a really big concept at the moment in modern history writing. So, especially in the histories of, say indentured labourers. So the fact that a lot of labour in places in the Pacific, the labour was brought into those places only male labour or only female labour. So genders were separated. So this question of whether, particularly men and women, but any people who have love relationships, regardless of the nature, but particularly when men and women, because most people are, heterosexual is the dominant kind of sexuality. This intimacy and the role of having real intimacy between a husband and wife, or man or woman, and the political implications of that's something which is actually very, very a very major topic in history at the moment, especially from this sort of history below perspective, and also in global history. So for instance, there's this book on this topic by a scholar who's actually a scholar of Asian American studies called Lisa Lowe, and the book is called The Intimacies of Four Continents. The Intimacies of Four Continents, and it's a very influential book in a range of fields, including modern global history. So I found that interesting, the sort of interaction of the content. She doesn't mention, Jia Jinhua doesn't mention any of this. This is just something that I found interesting about the use of this idea of intimacy. Okay, so we then move on to part 3. And we see here we have 2 opening chapters, one by Ari Levine of Georgia University and one from Hilde de Weert in Leuven. The first one, Confucian Scholarship, Authoritative Discourses and State Institutions during the Northern Sung and its Precursors. And the next chapter, Neo-Confucian Learning and Governance during the Southern Sung and Yuan. So you see, Ari and Hilde, they know each other well. So they divided up. They divided this up, and they give us a very interesting analysis of the emergence of Neo-Confucianism, but also what role Neo-Confucianism plays in these big imperial states through this period. And both of them question various aspects. Ari Levine very much questions narratives that see Neo-Confucianism originating in the Northern Song state. He sort of indicates that the Northern Song state didn't have much time for these sort of ideas, and that again is a projection. That's a Southern Song projection of what happened in the Northern Song state. So there's these are two essays very much based in the historiography of medieval China, and I'm just going to, given the time issue, I'm going to skip on past these two chapters, even though I have about 20 pages of notes on them. I'm going to skip through those 20 pages of notes down to the third chapter of this part, which is Mark Halperin's chapter, which focuses directly on the relationship between Confucianism and Buddhism. And you see what we're doing in this part. I mean, this is the time period where Neo-Confucianism, Songshui emerges, right? Where Daoshui, Songshui, Jushui, whatever you want to call it, where it emerges. And this is obviously very important for this part. So Mark Halperin's chapter, Confucians and Buddhism, 900 to 1500, opens with the question, quote, during the 900 to 1500 epoch, Buddhism threatened, delighted, stimulated, reassured Confucians. Why the diversity? He answers this question partly through considering Neo-Confucianism's famously ambiguous relationship with Buddhism, as both vociferously critical of and deeply influenced by the Buddhist religion, but also by thinking about the development of the state during this period, something he does while seeing dynasties as inherently religious institutions. Given dynasties used religious ritual as a key part of justifying their authority, including through markers in the physical and urban world like shrines and temples, and that this practice was often organised by Confucians engaging Buddhism, the two traditions were also intimately linked in political and social practice, regardless of the theoretical schemes of the Neo-Confucians and others. So, fascinating chapter focusing directly on those relationships and on actual institutional and personal relationships between Confucians and Buddhists in that period, and in terms of how the various states operated. The next chapter from Man Shu focuses on the Song Neo-Confucian turns emphasis on family ritual, gender roles, and of course gender segregation, because Jushi's ideas are often associated with that. Shu's argument, articulated clearly and repeatedly from the beginning, is that the insecurities associated with the pre-Sung multi-state order and the fall of the Northern Sung and eventual conquest of the Southern Sung themselves led to a search for a yearning for social stability and order among male elites. Nonetheless, Shu is careful to point out that beyond prescriptive texts, other sources do not seem to indicate broad uptake of the ideas of Neo-Confucians in the practice of gender relations, even in the Southern Sung. So that chapter presents a range of interesting aspects of the relationship between sort of ideology and reality in the Southern Sung. The last chapter in this part is by Nicholas Tackett, also of the University of California, Berkeley. Nicholas Tackett's chapter, Confucian Statecraft and East Eurasian Interstate Relations, 900 to 1300, argues that the period between the 10th and 13th centuries marked a distinctive period in East Eurasian history. It was a period when no hegemonic power dominated the scene, permitting a multi-state order to flourish. Multiple competing states engaged with each other diplomatically to an unprecedented degree. Chinese institutions and classical thought circulated broadly in this era, impacting political culture everywhere. But the principal impact of Confucianism lay in the diplomatic arena rather than in the internal politics of individual states. In the diplomatic arena, Confucian statecraft was most evident in the ideological framework underlying the state system. But it also played a role restructuring a variety of concrete diplomatic practices, from the format and syntax of diplomatic letters to the reception ceremonies for foreign envoys. Confucianism then in this period not only provided models for state structure and more centralised control by non-central plane states, as discussed earlier by de Hasselier, but more importantly provided a structure of diplomacy for relations between a large number of states, with none of them being dominant during this period. Given the common misunderstanding of Tianxia system's hierarchy as being always centred on a Chinese empire, this first period where it represented universal diplomacy in East Asia is interesting exactly because it was the period where no single state dominated. Nobody could argue that the Southern Song or even the Northern Song was the dominant political or military force in East Asia, and yet this is the period where it happens. Tackett also emphasises that overall, quote, cultural flow was of course multi-directional. For example, as recent scholarship on the Sino-steppe relationship has made clear, the steppe could influence China just as much as China influenced the steppe. And also, quote, it has sometimes been argued erroneously about certain East Eurasian polities, the Khitan, Liao and the Jurchen Jin, for example, that the importation of Chinese culture involved a process of wholesale Sinicization. In fact, the Chinese cultural package was never dominant outside of China. It was incorporated into other neighbouring societies through a process of accretion, where it supplemented rather than replaced native practices and beliefs. It offered a technology of governance, end quote. Diplomacy, however, the system of interstate relations itself, is where Tackett sees Confucianism as particularly central. This then brings us on to part 4, the early modern period. This chronological part opens with a chapter by Lu Miaofen from Academia Sinica about approaches to life and death in Confucianism across East Asia from the 15th until the 19th centuries. Here we encounter immediately an example of the rejection of Jushi learning, which characterised the development of Confucianism in late Ming and Qing China, Tokugawa Japan, and to a lesser extent Choson Korea. This chapter thereby uses changes in thinking on a deeply religious or metaphysical aspect of Confucianism to show how the increasingly commercialised and integrated societies of East Asia in this period begin to find a new role for Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism's religiosity and emphasis on individual salvation changes the context of Confucian learning in terms of content. This goes hand in hand with a decreasingly effective examination system in the Ming and Qing, where of course the population growth outstripped the capacity of the exam system to offer positions, and in Tokugawa Japan and Choson Korea, where the examination system never overrid class. Class was the determiner of authority. So this transformed, seeing the examinations didn't work basically, this transformed the motivation to engage with Confucianism into something more personal or religious. This then leads to a practice of Confucianism which saw, as Lu shows, Confucians reject Zhu Xi's own rather grim vision of life and death. Lan Hongyue's paper focuses on the interaction between shared trajectories of critique, again, critique of Neo-Confucianism, but in the practice of diplomacy between states in China, the Ming and the Qing, Japan, and Choson Korea. Julia Murray's chapter on images in the practice and popularization of Confucianism is an art history analysis of the imagery associated with Confucius and Confucian practice. The image Murray projects is one of a Confucianism increasingly based, again, in people's private practice in a society undergoing increasing commercialization, urbanization, and associated developments. So you see here this pattern, which is not, it just appeared in these chapters, where as we move into early modern society, what's called individualization sometimes of practice. We then move on to the last chapter of this part, which is Lionel Jensen's chapter. Is it here? Yeah. Confucius and his sayings circulating memes in multi-continental communities of practice. Lionel Jensen's chapter expands the global reach of the volume significantly as it analyses both the famous Jesuit transmission of Confucian ideas to Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries and their impact on early Enlightenment thinkers like Leibniz and on Voltaire, as well as the lesser known yet comparably influential impact of Confucianism among thinkers of the new American Republic, from Thomas Paine to Benjamin Franklin, as well as the transcendentalists Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Through this dynamic and globally influential history, Jensen also explores the dual nature of Confucianism as both historically bounded but also appealing to an aesthetic of timelessness. Quote, "The timeless sage was always understood within the observer's own time." End quote. For Jensen, Confucianism's orality, both in the nature of the early texts like Analects and Mencius, but also in the way Confucianism was practiced by the Jesuits and American transcendentalists, was a key part of both its timeless appeal and also its ability to move between vastly different times and spaces and cultures. Reasoning by example, and what Jensen calls the he said nature of the texts, is for Jensen the key to their wide cultural and temporal reach, and what makes Confucius, in Jensen's word, quote, a transnational cultural hero, end quote. This point resonates with Mick Hunter's much earlier chapter, the first chapter of the volume, which also saw the oral nature of transmission and the textual signatures of that orality as key to the endurance and influence of Confucian teachings through the very, very different social structures of early China. The fact that Jensen sees this same aspect as key to the cultural reformulation of Confucianism in early 19th century United States of America is intriguing. Returning to the significance of the cultural reconstruction of Confucianism in early modern and modern Europe and the United States, Jensen writes, quote, "An ideology of enlightened modernity hovers above any interpretation of Confucianism's conceptual history because it is a centuries weathered cornerstone of the humanities and thus a critical part of the commonwealth of learning. From the 17th and 18th centuries, Confucius and his moral sayings were prominent topics in the long-distance community of both lay and religious called the Republic of Letters. The takeaway point here on the significance of this reformulation of Confucianism is its connected and modern nature. It is from this point that Confucianism not only becomes known literally around the globe, but also forms a key part of not only Enlightenment thought, but as Jensen puts it, quote, enlightened modernity. So, yeah, that last chapter of part 4 is sort of fantastic because I feel like it's a booster rocket that launches us into a fully global and then a fully modern historical narrative. And what follows are these chapters in the modern period, looking at the role of Confucius in the modern period. And as I mentioned, oh, that's the wrong computer. And as I mentioned at the end, a couple of very modern influenced chapters that are thematic as well. So I don't think, looking at the time, I see we've only got 20 minutes left, so I'm not going to go through the modern chapters. I think I'll just leave my comments there. I think that chapter by Lionel Jensen is a great way to finish the introduction of this volume. It's certainly a chapter I find very exciting to read. So I'll leave it there and hand over to any discussion, critique, questions, and so on.
Thank you. Yes, this is wonderful, and certainly makes me very looking forward to read the book. It's very interesting. So let's start. I'll open the floor to questions. Anybody? Yes, please.
I want to thank Professor Paramore for sharing with us such a so abundant of information about the content of these chapters. Must be a very tiring task for you. Yes, but also thank you. They are very informative. My question is, after having some obtaining some general impressions about the general content of each chapters, there's one question that is lingering in my mind. That is, how would you, or I mean, as an editor, or how the authors of these chapters, how do they understand, how do they define Confucianism? Because sometimes adopting the Chinese system doesn't mean that you adopt Confucianism, isn't it? So if I look at these chapters, one thing I will look for is which part I will regard it as Confucian element. That will be more informative to me, actually. So that is my...
Is it working? Yeah. Good question. Good question. Absolutely. I mean, that's a real problem, obviously, for thinking about this volume. There's a couple of things I can say about that. The first thing is that you notice those first few chapters, they're very careful about that. Yeah, very, very careful. And you almost do have a definition emerging to some degree. It's a very different definition to what you'd normally have. It's a much more historic definition. It's much more about processes rather than values or virtues, I guess. But you do have that emerging. Is the view of what is Confucian and what is not, is it the same through all the chapters? That's one question. Now, I would say no, it's not the same through all the chapters, but it's not massively different. Probably Tunica de Hassler's chapter is the one that moves away the most from what would be considered Confucianism, and also in terms of the exam, because I've read all the chapters, in terms of the content. A lot of the chapters, I emphasised their methodological approach or their social history impact. But when you read the chapters, that they deliberately use material which clearly is Confucian, for instance, written by Confucian writers, or playing institutional roles that are associated with the way that Confucianism is embedded in that particular society. So in most of the chapters, the way you would answer why is this Confucian is because of the sources being used. The sources are clearly, you'd clearly identify as Confucian. For instance, in Tinaka Hasselaar's chapter, maybe not so much actually, but she marks what she's doing. Like you notice she uses that wonderful word, applied Confucianism, and she uses that term, applied Confucianism, and she also states, talks about this issue. So she doesn't claim, that everything she's writing about is the product of Confucianism. So that's one way to answer your question. And another way to sort of come back at the question is you'll notice that Brindley, Churchman and de Hasselaar also always make the point that in the reality of the history they're looking at, Confucianism and at least Buddhism, but also other traditions, are functioning together with each other. Yeah. So you could also defend the approach by saying the historical reality of the use of Confucianism at that time and place was that it was mixed with all these other traditions. That could be, if I was a rhetoricist, if I wanted to do rhetoric rather than answer your question, I would give that answer. But the earlier comments I made are also true, right? That yes, this is an issue. Most authors deal with it by sticking to sources where everybody would agree what they are. But yeah, there definitely is there's a change in the definition. There's definitely a change in the definition. Sometimes that's to do with the scholar, but also sometimes to do with the period. So, for instance, if we think of Nicholas Tackett's chapter, I mean, that's my period in the early modern period, and just in the late medieval period. It's absolutely clear that the written sources of diplomatic communication between the states in those areas used Confucian paradigms. They always quote, from Mencius and quote from various other Confucian writers. So by that stage, diplomacy, the role of Confucianism in diplomacy had to develop to an extent where the letters, and of course we have a lot of letters, we have a lot of diplomatic letters from the late medieval and early modern period, where we know from the sources that the content of written communication in diplomacy was undeniably Confucian, and that was the paradigm that they used to show similar ways of looking at the world. Even in societies where both of the societies, Buddhism was actually more socially prevalent than Confucianism, the diplomatic letters would quote from the Confucian texts, not Buddhist texts. So that's just a shift that occurred in the history. So the shift in definition is not only a shift in definition of scholars, it's also a shift in the reality of what was happening through the different periods.
Any other question? So maybe I can follow up a little bit. So because that's also my question. So when I was listening to the talk, I kept feeling that there seems to be, of course it's probably not a shift, but it's hard for me to make a distinction between Confucianism, Confucian culture, and then Chinese culture, right? Which are, to me, three different things. And applied Confucianism might be something that's Confucian culture, but not necessarily Confucianism, right? So, so if we go back to the early period, you know that there were like 100 schools, right? So when we say Confucianism, we might be saying Confucianism instead of, for example, Buddhism. That's one way to mark Confucianism. But when maybe philosophers or thinkers who are very concerned with the early periods, we think about Taoism, we think about Moism, we think about legalism, and especially a lot of times we feel that, well, later times Confucianism is kind of being used to cover up the legalist aspect of thought, which is not really Confucianism per se. And so we're just curious, like, right? So there seems to be at least some kind of synthesis at the institution level where there is Confucianism and legalism and maybe a little bit Taoism in there. But then for the everyday life, there is even more mix in there. Is a Taoism in there, and there is these other aspects that, how do you, for example, you could say that, well, because these thinkers resort to texts that think, the authors think that they are Confucians, but they might be also under the influence of Taoism or legalism, or, right? So how do you steer clear to Confucian? Or maybe that's not even your concern. Yeah.
Working? Yeah. Good question. Let me try and answer like a historian, right? So to begin with, the simple answer is through the historical sources. The simple answer is how you define through the historical sources, right? So let me give examples from 3 different periods, 3 concrete examples. You talked about this, this idea within, this idea of Moist, the 100 schools, Moist versus Zhuangzi versus Confucius. This is nothing to do with history, right? Let's look at how the early period chapters in this book talk about the Han Dynasty, and you see that in the Han Dynasty, indeed, legalism. Several of the scholars in the first part mention the fact that Confucianism in application always includes legalism, always includes what is referred to in philosophy as legalism, right? In reality, these 2 things are never engaged, right? Never disengaged. So, and I think a lot of people, theoretical, like philosophers, people who consider themselves philosophers of Confucianism today, accept the fact that Confucianism always includes those so-called legalist texts, right? So that is part of the tradition. Certainly in the Han, I think it's undeniable, historically it's undeniable if you look at, and you see that in the chapters, if you look at in the Han Dynasty, when Confucian ideas are used and when Confucian texts are cited, always alongside texts which we associate with the legal tradition. So that's one historical period. And then to move on to what is a bit related to what is Confucian and what is not. I talked about the Ritsuryo system, right? In Japanese history, it's called the Ritsuryo system, right? But this system that Tineka Hasala speaks about, the administrative system that is adopted by all these states, right? So administrative system that's in the Sui, it's actually influenced by Northern Wei system, right? So it's an administrative system that if you trace the history of the administrative system, some people say it's actually Northern Wei, that it's actually, in a sense, it's non-Chinese administrative system originally, right? But when it's adopted by the Sui and codified in a number of legal texts by the Sui, one of the core parts of the establishment of that system is the academy, is the Confucian Academy, right? Another core part of it is the use of Confucian ritual for the sacralization of the emperor and for the succession of new emperors. So, of course, as we all know, the Sui was a state which was deeply Buddhist, right? And these administrative systems were very influenced by, if we want to call them, Turkic cultures, right? So you've got a Buddhist state with administrative system influenced by Turkic cultures. But the content of that administrative system, privileged in terms of the key markers of state authority, it privileged Confucian paradigms. And that is why those laws, the best extant examples in text are the Japanese Ritsuryo legal texts, but there are partial examples of the Sui texts that they was based on. There's partial remnants of those Sui texts are also extant. And if you look at all those texts, you see that in terms of imperial succession, justification of imperial rule, and the key points of organisation of the bureaucracy were overtly identified in relation to the Confucian tradition. So that is why that system, I don't think it's possible to not see that system as Confucian. Is it only Confucian? No. It was originated by a Buddhist state based on Turkic examples, but it self-identified as Confucian, and most certainly when it was adopted in places like Kogyo and Bohai and Japan, it was definitely seen as Confucian. And I've actually written an article about this, actually, about the Japanese adoption of this system. And actually the fact that the adoption of the system was problematic for the Japanese. They didn't like for instance, the use of Confucian rituals to justify the position of the emperor. In the Japanese Ritsuro system, they removed all of those, and that's when they invented this Shinto sort of rituals. So even in the rejection of Confucian elements, you see how in this case, how the Japanese court culture identified this as a Confucian object. So that's why that would be considered Confucian. And then the third the sources I would use from the next historical period I already referred to is the diplomatic correspondence from the 1400s, and particularly from the late 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, which again, luckily I've done research on myself, right? If you look at that diplomatic correspondence, even though the actual states were not necessarily run in a Confucian form, but the content of the letters, the way the letters, the form of diplomacy was undoubtedly Confucian. And many of the people writing those letters were Buddhist monks. You know, they weren't Confucians, but the actual source itself, right? The actual way that object was created. And this is a problem we have a lot. You know, when we look back from modernity, we expect all these traditions to fit. Are these a Confucian elite? Oh, but they're Buddhists. Is this a Buddhist group? But in pre-modern societies, it doesn't work like that. In pre-modern societies, diplomacy might be something that you do in a Confucian term. A diplomat might be a Buddhist monk. A woman might be somebody who has no power. Oh, except if you're deciding who the next emperor should be, and we leave that to the women. You know, so again, the roles differ, I guess, in that sense. Yeah. So the answer would be through the historical sources, and there are 3 examples I would give.
So while people are thinking, maybe I ask another question. I'm just curious, because of this possible difficulty that we have to say this is to label them as Confucianism, which of course you have your reason to do it. I'm just wondering why originally you want to make a history of Confucianism instead of, I don't know, other angle to touching this. Yeah.
Good question. How should I answer this? I could make up an answer, or I could tell you the truth. Well, the press came to me, right? So Cambridge University Press, they think they can market a Cambridge history based around the concept /word / Confucianism. Now let's think why that is. That comes back to something I spoke about yesterday. In international relations, in writing on international relations, in writing in global politics, Confucianism, that word is used a lot. And there are a lot of IR scholars out there who write books that sell really well for academic books. And they're explaining international relations through Confucianism. That is, if I can say something personal, that is also the reason why personally I use the word. I don't need to use the word Confucianism at all. I made a choice 15 years ago to use this. Actually, when I made the transition from Japanese academia to European academia, just after that, and in the process of trying to work out how the hell do I do academia outside East Asia? I'd done a PhD at the University of Tokyo in Japanese, fully in Japanese historiography. How the hell do I deal with these Europeans and working in Europe? How do I do this? And as part of that trauma that I went through over about 5 years, one of the things I realized is they use this word. This word is used everywhere, right? And also, if I give up, am I going to give this word up to the IR scholars? Am I going to give them? Am I going to let the IR scholars control the way that history is used in thinking about politics? Because if I give them that word, then that's their word. Oh, I'm too pure to use the word Confucianism. I'm a historian. I couldn't possibly refer to Confucianism. I'll talk about whatever, classic culture or whatever. But then they've got the word. And if I write a book about global classic culture, or East Asian classic culture, imagine if you're an ordinary English-speaking person or ordinary European or American or whatever, and you see a book on the shelf and it says, East Asian classic culture and politics. So the word. So I think there's this aspect as well. So that's the reason I started doing it, and that's the reason I think why the press uses this. But having now been through this process, especially through this very arduous task of editing this book and having a pandemic and all the other terrible things that have happened in the last few years. What a 5 years, Jesus. What I've realised going through that process is I actually think it's really good. I actually think it's really useful to use the word, because people have been using the word Confucianism through modernity. I mean, since in the Republic of Letters, that's why I love Lionel Jensen's chapter, because he's got that wonderful phrase where he says something like, over 400 years of early modern and modern intellectual discourse, this has existed, and has influenced people. So, I mean, if it's good enough for Ralph Waldo Emerson and Benjamin Franklin, and Leibniz, that's another element as well. I think it's worth pursuing, and I think the more you do pursue it, I love the questions today, like this question about, well, what is Confucian, what's not, and then answering that and talking about the fact that a text might be Confucian, whereas the person who wrote that text might not be, or vice versa. I think those sort of conversations are really useful and interesting and deepen the discussion. I think they're useful conversations in their own right. And if we weren't using the word Confucianism, we wouldn't have those conversations. Yeah.
Any one last minute question? Yes? No? Well, maybe we can save our questions for later. We will have another session to look forward to tomorrow and then on Friday. So let's give a big hand to our speaker. Thank you.